dropped from dreadnoughts, hitting the surface with nuclear force. The sky turned white-hot, shockwaves ripping through the alien cities. Then came the troops, deploying in waves, their mechs and exosuits crushing through screaming, writhing Vraelin bioforms, but something was wrong. The Vraelin didn't resist, they didn't fight to defend their world, they just watched. From within the ruins, from the shadows of their burning city, they observed, unmoving, silent. Raines stood in the dropship bay, eyes narrowed. This wasn't a battle. This was a trap, and humanity had already fallen into it. The silence of Reach 9 was louder than the detonations. Fires raged across the alien city, but there was no desperate counterattack, no last stand. The Vraelin stood in the ruins, their chitinous bodies reflecting the flames, their glowing hive minds linked, watching without fear. Raines disembarked from the dropship, boots crunching against scorched organic ground. This wasn't victory. Something was deeply wrong. Voss stood ahead, her armor streaked with alien blood, her eyes burning with frustration. "They're letting us win," she spat. "They're not fighting back." Kerr was kneeling beside one of the fallen creatures, scanning it. His face had gone pale. "It's not just that." His voice was tight. "They're evolving." Raines frowned. "What?" Kerr turned the scanner, showing a DNA sequence shifting in real time. "Their genetic code is adapting to our attacks. They're learning from our weapons, our tactics. Every kill is making them stronger." A chill ran through the squad. The Vraelin weren't losing. They were changing. Before Raines could respond, a thunderous roar ripped through the city. The ground cracked, and from beneath the ruins something emerged. It was massive. A grotesque fusion of Vraelin and human DNA. Its limbs too long, its eyes too human. A war form, unlike any seen before. Kerr's breath caught. "They've started using our genetic markers." And then it charged. The first wave of Marines was torn apart in seconds. The warform moved faster than anything recorded, its limbs shifting mid-strike, adjusting to counter human weaponry. Bullets ricocheted off its shifting hide. Plasma rounds barely scorched it. It adapted instantly. The TDS Revenant rained down, orbital support, but the creature absorbed the energy, its exoskeleton glowing, feeding on the heat. Voss roared, unleashing a barrage from her pulse gauntlets, but the warform dodged before she even fired. "They're predicting us," Kerr shouted. Raines made the call. "Fall back! Now!" The retreat was brutal. Every human that fell was absorbed into the biomass, their bodies twisted, reshaped. The Vraelin weren't fighting a war, they were evolving a new species. Back aboard, the TDS Revenant, the command deck was in chaos. Kerr's team analyzed the battle data, their expressions growing more grim by the second. "They didn't destroy Erebus 4 out of malice," Kerr muttered, piecing together the puzzle. "They were stopping this from happening." Voss's fists clenched. "Bullshit." "No," Kerr continued, voice unsteady. "The Vraelin didn't attack us because we were expanding. They attacked because humanity settled on contaminated ground." Raines' voice was low. "Explain." Kerr's hands shook as he pulled up the data. Erebus 4's soil contained ancient genetic markers. A pathogen. A bioweapon left behind by something older than the Vraelin. The room went cold. "The Vraelin's entire warform technology is based on adaptation," Kerr continued. "They use controlled evolution, but this..." He pointed to the mutated warform still rampaging on the surface below. "This is not their doing. This is something else." A warning klaxon blared. Incoming transmission. The hollow projector flickered. The Vraelin emissary had returned. Its form was unstable now, its glowing nodes pulsing erratically. "You are beginning to see?" Voss was on the verge of ordering the transmission cut, but Raines lifted a hand. He wanted to hear this. "The choice was taken from you the moment you set foot on that world," the Vraelin continued. "The ancient ones left behind their weapons, buried in forgotten soil. We fought for eons to contain it. Your presence disturbed the balance, and now it spreads." Raines stared, pulse hammering. The pieces fell into place. Erebus 4 hadn't been wiped out. It had been sterilized. The Vraelin hadn't destroyed the colony out of cruelty. They had done it to stop this horror from spreading. And now, humanity's thirst for vengeance had set it free. The war wasn't between humans and Vraelin anymore. It was against something much, much worse. Aboard the TDS Revenant, the War Council sat in grim silence. The Vraelin emissary's words hung in the air like a specter. You have disturbed the balance. Now, it spreads. The holodisplay flickered, showing real-time footage from Riche 9. The Vraelin biocities were crumbling, their once fluid structures fossilizing into something grotesque, and in their place, the warforms that had absorbed human DNA were growing. Not just Vraelin anymore. Not just human. Something new. Something uncontrollable. Admiral Raines exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the war table. This wasn't just a campaign of vengeance anymore. This was survival. Tell me we have a way to stop this, he said, his voice edged with steel. Dr. Kerr shook his head. Our weapons aren't effective. The more we kill them, the more they adapt. Even if we glass the entire planet, we don't know if spores or genetic remnants will survive. General Voss's eyes were locked on the feed, her knuckles white. Then we don't just glass it, she said. We erase it. Raines turned to her. She met his gaze, unflinching. Deploy the singularity bomb. A silence settled over the war room. The singularity bomb, a controlled collapse of a localized star core creating a miniature black hole. It wasn't just a weapon of destruction. It was total annihilation. Nothing left. No DNA, no soil, no memories, nothing. Raines felt a chill settle in his bones. We have over 3,000 ground forces still down there. Voss didn't blink. And we lose everyone if we don't stop this now. A brutal calculation. 3,000 versus humanity itself. Raines's jaw tightened. He turned to Kerr. Tell me there's another way. Kerr hesitated. There might be. Voss scoffed. There's always a might. We don't have time for. Kerr cut her off. We override their genetic programming. Silence. Kerr continued, urgency in his voice. The Vraelin engineered their warforms to obey the hive mind. But this mutation is breaking that link. If we can reinforce their original coding, we might be able to shut them down, force them into dormancy. Raines leaned forward. You think you can do that? Kerr swallowed. With the right signal? Maybe. Raines closed his eyes for a brief moment, then turned to the fleet commander. Start prepping the singularity bomb. Voss smirked, but it faded when Raines added, It's our backup plan. Then he turned to Kerr. You've got one shot. The landing craft tore through the atmosphere, Raines and Kerr strapped in as the rest of the strike team prepped for the drop. Below them, Riche 9 had become unrecognizable. Twisted spires of biomass stretched to the sky, and creatures that should not exist moved in the ruins. The human Vraelin warforms were changing again. As they neared the ground, a new horror unfolded. The warforms weren't just mutating. They were absorbing the remaining human troops' armor, flesh, weapons. It didn't matter. Everything was being rewritten, repurposed, reformed. Jesus Christ. Someone whispered in the comms. The dropship barely had time to land before the horrors turned their attention upward. They screeched in unison, a sound not of war, but recognition. They knew, and they were waiting. They fought their way through the ruins, the warforms anticipating every attack. Kerr's device was secured to his chest, a portable biowave emitter, pre-programmed with the original Vraelin hive mind signal. They just had to reach the central hive tower and activate it. If it worked, the mutation would cease. If it failed, there would be no time to deploy the bomb. Raines's rifle spat plasma as he and his remaining troops pushed forward. The air was thick with organic decay, the sound of flesh knitting itself together, bodies shifting in ways they never should. Kerr was typing furiously, running calculations, adjusting the signal frequency. Almost there, he gasped. Voss turned, emptying an entire clip into a war form that had once been one of their own. Make it faster. They reached the hive tower, a grotesque construct half-metal, half-living organism. Kerr set the emitter down, locked in the transmission, and the war form stopped. Not all at once, but in waves, like a ripple in reality. Their screeches became distorted, their movements erratic. Some collapsed outright, their bodies liquefying into genetic sludge, and then silence. Raines stood frozen, breath heaving. It had worked. The mutation had been halted, but Kerr's face was still pale. It's not dead, he whispered. It's just dormant. A single war form still remained standing. Its head tilted, eyes locked on Raines. Then it spoke. In a human voice. You have only delayed what comes next. The fleet remained on high alert as the teams were evacuated. The singularity bomb was not deployed. The planet remained intact. But the war had changed. The Terran Directorate classified Reach 9 as quarantined. No ships were allowed within 100 light years. The official record stated that the Vraelin had been neutralized. The truth was different. The mutation still existed. And worse, it had learned. Kerr theorized that the override signal wouldn't hold forever. The mutation was intelligent, not just evolving physically, but strategically. Raines stood at the viewing window of the TDS Revenant, watching the darkened planet below. He knew what Kerr wasn't saying out loud. This war wasn't over, it had just begun. 20 years later, deep space surveillance detected a faint distress beacon. The signal was old, corrupted, but the voice was unmistakable. Admiral Raines, you thought the Vraelin were the enemy. A pause. You have no idea what's coming. Transmission ends. The aftermath of Reich 9 hung over the fleet like a funeral shroud. The battle was won, but no one felt victorious. The Third Fleet remained in orbit, observing the lifeless surface below. The warforms had gone still, their grotesque bodies frozen mid-mutation. The override signal had worked, for now. Inside the TDS Revenant, Admiral Raines stood in the war room staring at the strategic map. The Vraelin homeworld was still there, intact. The weight of his decision pressed against his chest. He had ordered the override signal stopping the mutation, but he hadn't destroyed the planet. He had let it live. He had let them live. General Voss, arms crossed, glared at the screen. This is a mistake, she said, voice low. We should have dropped the bomb. Raines didn't look at her. We don't know what we were dealing with. Exactly, she snapped. Which is why we should have wiped it out. Dr. Kerr leaned against the table, rubbing his temples. His face was drawn, his mind still processing what had happened. The mutation wasn't just a biological evolution, he murmured. It was learning. It was adapting not just to our weapons, but to our thinking. It knew we wouldn't destroy the planet. It knew we'd hesitate. Voss scoffed. That's assuming it's even still conscious. As far as I can tell, we shut it down. Kerr shook his head. That's the thing about intelligence, General. It doesn't just disappear. It waits. A chill ran through the room. The Vraelin. Warforms were silent, but silence wasn't death. And something deep in Raines's gut told him they were watching. The Terran Directorate High Command demanded answers. The loss of 3,000 soldiers and the destruction of Reach 9 had shaken the military's confidence. But the truth, it would never reach the public. Raines stood before the Terran Council, his report a carefully crafted half-truth. The Vraelin threat has been neutralized, he said. Their bioweapons were successfully disabled, and their military infrastructure is in complete collapse. Officially, the war was over. The fleet was recalled. The sector quarantined. No one, not humans, not AIs, not traitors, would ever enter Vraelin space again, and just like that, history was rewritten. But some wounds don't heal. Voss resigned from the military 6 months later. If we had wiped them out, she told Raines in her final transmission, we wouldn't have to fear what comes next. Raines never responded. Dr. Kerr disappeared into the shadows of the Xeno Research Division, studying what remained of the warform samples. His last message to Raines was cryptic. The override signal is degrading. I don't know how long it will last. But Admiral, this wasn't just a mutation. It was an awakening. Raines never responded to that either. For years, nothing came from the quarantine zone. No signals, no movement. The official record stood unchallenged. Humanity moved on. But Raines? He never did. He often found himself staring at the classified files, listening to the old transmission over and over again. The final words of that last warform, "You have only delayed what comes next." And every night he wondered if somewhere in the cold void of space something was still watching, waiting. The signal came 20 years later. It was weak, corrupted by time and distance, but unmistakably human. Deep space surveillance operators, stationed on the outermost Terran listening post, Bastion 17, nearly ignored it. It was old, its frequency degraded by solar interference. But the voice, the moment the audio was cleaned up, the station's entire command deck fell silent. It was Admiral Isaac Raines. You thought the Vraelin were the enemy. The transmission crackled, fragmented with static, but his voice carried through. You have no idea what's coming. A long pause. They weren't trying to kill us. They were trying to stop it. We never should have. Static swallowed the rest of the message. The operators exchanged stunned glances before forwarding the data directly to Terran High Command. Within hours, it was classified at the highest level. Within days, all records of Bastion 17's detection logs were erased, but the message had already spread through the black channels of the military. Isaac Raines was dead, had been for almost 2 decades. And yet, the signal was coming from beyond the quarantined Vraelin sector, beyond the void, beyond known space. Something had found him, or he had found.